Thank you for inviting me to take part in this conference and for joining me today to discuss trustworthy data governance. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respect to their elders, past and present, and their emerging leaders. I've been asked to speak about sharing with the private sector, roles and responsibilities. I'm taking this to be the sharing of health data, and in particular, the sharing of health data from a public health system where data has been principally collected for the purpose of providing people with care and treatment. What roles and responsibilities should we recognise when such data is being shared with the private sector, particularly if it's being disclosed for secondary purposes, that is, purposes that go beyond an individual's direct care? Now, we ask this question at a time when there's some evidence people are increasingly uncomfortable sharing health data, especially with commercial end users, including tech companies. And there are also reports of declining levels of trust more generally in organisations and how they handle personal information. In this environment, should we even be considering sharing health data with the private sector? Data collected by health professionals who still enjoy relatively high levels of trust, sharing that data with private companies, particularly data-driven companies, who are not currently as trusted? Well, sometimes the answer may be that no, we should not. But also sometimes the reality will be that if we don't, then we're going to make it more difficult to achieve some of the things that people want, including improvements in care. Many of the benefits associated with big data and machine learning in the healthcare context are reliant upon sharing and partnerships between the public and private sector. Consider for a moment the situation that the Royal Free Hospital Trust found itself in. It had identified an important and serious clinical issue, acute kidney injury, and recognised it could more successfully treat that if clinicians were alerted to risks posed to particular patients earlier. They wanted to enable more targeted and effective healthcare delivery. What they needed was a better way to extract and use data that was already in their systems. In short, the hospital wanted to develop an app that clinicians could use on mobile devices to detect acute kidney injury at an earlier point and improve patient care. It was a hospital. It wasn't a software or app developer. In order to do what it wanted, in order to do what it saw was necessary to improve patient care, it needed technical expertise it did not possess in-house. Unfortunately for the hospital, reaching out for help in the way that it did prompted a significant backlash. There was some very negative media reporting. In part, this is because the company that the hospital shared patient data with to enable the app's development and testing was DeepMind, and DeepMind is part of the Google portfolio. The hospital provided around 1.6 million patient records to Google DeepMind to aid in the testing of the Streams app. When the regulator investigated, it found that this disclosure was not one that would have been reasonably expected by patients. And the problem here wasn't just that it was shared with Google, although that was undoubtedly a contributory factor. There are other examples, such as with the Irish Biobank now, where the involvement of a private company has generated negative press headlines and some levels of public concern. Now, this reaction isn't just because people are surprised to find that they're sharing with the private sector. It's also because of public disquiet and discomfort due to relatively low levels of trust with the big data companies. Research done by Ipsos Mori, commissioned by the Wellcome Trust and reported in One Way Mirror, is just one piece of work that confirms the idea that there's considerable wariness and skepticism about the idea of commercial access to healthcare data. In that work, 4 key tests were described. It was said that people apply these tests when determining the acceptability of secondary uses of health data. They were the tests of why, who, what, and how. Of these 4 tests, the research by Wellcome showed that people are most concerned with why data is being shared and with whom. Undoubtedly, some uses of data tended to be more acceptable. This was when the why was a clear public benefit and the who a public health provider. Similarly, some uses were typically unacceptable. That was when the why was a private benefit and the who was a body with no link to improving public health. In between these 2 extremes, the research showed there was a space where acceptability is much less clear-cut. Where there's a mix of public and private benefit, there may be conditions under which public-private partnerships are acceptable and circumstances in which they will not be. So this is where we find ourselves. At a time when if we look to the expertise that private companies possess to realise public benefits, we may be entering difficult terrain. Where there's a mix of private and public benefit, it's not straightforwardly a red light or a green light situation, but rather an amber light one, meaning we should proceed with caution. So what roles and responsibilities might attach to sharing with the private sector that might protect and promote public confidence in trustworthy uses of data? Let me start by briefly explaining how I'm using the term trustworthy here. A person or a thing is trustworthy if that trust is well grounded, if it's worthy of the trust that's placed in it. But this in turn is associated not only with competence. You trust a doctor to know what they're doing and to be capable of treating you safely, but you also trust their integrity and, importantly, their beneficence. You rely upon the doctor not only being capable of treating you safely, but being motivated to do so. You trust that they want to make you better. Individuals and organisations are trustworthy when they can be relied upon not to take unfair advantage of a vulnerability, relied upon to act in accordance with the best interests of those that are depending upon them. Okay, so it's worth pausing just now to make clear that while trustworthiness is important, and that's what I understand to be trustworthy, trustworthiness isn't always what we should be focused on when we're considering sharing with the private sector. We should not always be relying on trust. We should sometimes be seeking to remove a vulnerability. Insofar as governance systems seek to remove vulnerability, what they're aspiring to is not to demonstrate how parties are trustworthy, but rather they're relying on the system itself being trustless. There are times and circumstances where we do want to avoid a reliance upon trust and seek to reduce vulnerability. Simple examples: when you go through airport security, the security screening is there so you don't need to trust other passengers are not bringing dangerous items on board. There's no trust when you search the teenager's bedroom for illicit items. But trustless systems do sometimes come with a cost. And often that cost is in the lost opportunities and the damaged relationships. If I don't share information with a private company, if I don't expose any vulnerability, then I might frustrate their ability to do things with the information that I want. So sometimes vulnerability and trustworthiness is helpful, and at most times in some ways it's unavoidable if you want to achieve particular things. The challenge then is to remove unnecessary vulnerability and ensure that any vulnerability that remains is not only necessary but also proportionate to the public gain. We should be relying on trust no more than is necessary and proportionate to the value proposition that we can articulate to those whose data is being used. However, where it is in the public interest to allow a vulnerability, then it's important to ensure that private organisation is worthy of the trust that we place in it. In this context, robust governance and demonstrated trustworthiness can enable things to happen that would otherwise be difficult. Robust privacy protection can enable successful partnerships and can enable data to flow. By here, I don't mean by privacy protection locking up data and throwing away the key. I mean ensuring data is used, but is only used consistent with people's reasonable expectations. What uses of data, for what purposes, by whom do people want to see and have reason to accept in the circumstances? When I was in the UK, I conducted some research with colleagues Victoria Chico at the University of Sheffield and Amanda Hunn at the Health Research Authority. We wanted to explore what I've described as that amber light space identified by Wellcome, that space between the relatively clear-cut examples of using health data for public health benefit by a public health provider and using data for solely private benefit by a commercial body. We wanted to explore the conditions under which use might be acceptable when we were in that amber light area and there was a mix of public and private benefit. Now, we found that although people may have an instinctive reaction against the prospect of sharing patient-level data, even if de-identified with commercial organisations, views were more nuanced when people learned the kind of good that commercial organisations might provide, the kind of role they might play in developing and delivering data-driven healthcare. Now, in our work, it emerged that participants unanimously felt two conditions should apply when commercial organisations sought access to patient data. The public body, in this case the NHS, should receive a proportionate benefit, and it should be involved in the development of the product or service at all stages. This isn't a tokenistic or superficial involvement. It should be end-to-end involvement, right through from commissioning, through the development, up to the point of endorsement. This told us something about where and in whom people were willing to invest their trust. It also tells us something about the importance of meaningful public engagement, not superficial or box-ticking engagement, but the kind of engagement that puts people in a position where they are responsible for the decisions with regard to the purposes for which their data is being used. When the partnership between Royal Free and DeepMind received negative headlines, DeepMind issued a mea culpa. They said, in our initial rush to collaborate with nurses and doctors to create products that address the clinical need, we didn't do enough to make patients and the public aware of our work or invite them to challenge and shape our priorities. Companies seeking to use health data should not seek only to make patients and public aware of their work. They should invite them to challenge and shape their priorities. Public organisations partnering with private companies might also do the same, either independently or as part of the joint enterprise. There's also then, of course, a need for robust data sharing agreements that maintain control over both purpose and means, so far as possible, and provide means of auditing that use. These controls and capacities to audit must reach through into derived and inferred data in both identifiable and non-identifiable forms, so that in total, any commercial benefit can be demonstrably no more than necessary and proportionate to the public good. As well as the partners involved, there's also a role for public bodies to play a part in establishing the conditions of trustworthiness and to determine what individuals and community expectations are and what people have reason to accept in different circumstances. Here I give just one example action by the National Data Guardian in England and Wales, who has pursued a programme of public engagement to better understand reasonable expectations with regard to secondary uses of health data. There's also an important role for regulators here. Sometimes it's only going to be a well-resourced regulator who is able to effectively understand and audit the data practices of commercial organisations. This is often complicated and technical stuff, and it's not reasonable to leave individuals to protect their own interests and the interests of their community through safeguards such as notice and consent alone. The regulator does need, however, a legal framework to support their work. And I finish by briefly reflecting on the role that might be played in this context by a requirement for fair processing in privacy and data protection law. If the requirement to be fair were understood to require that data is only used where data subjects have reason to accept that use, where for those whose data is being used, any trade-off is both fair and reasonable, and the obligation is put on organizations to demonstrate how they have made that calculation, how that judgment has been both made and informed, then this responsibility might promote trustworthy governance. There's no time now to go into it in detail, but I note in passing the interesting proposals in Indian Privacy and Data Protection Bill now being considered. The bill introduces a statutory concept for data fiduciary, and protection in that context is determined by reference to the purposes that a data principal would reasonably expect, having regard to the purpose, context, and circumstances of data collection. So, to finish, I'll simply ask you to remember that persons have no reason to accept an unavoidable or unnecessary vulnerability. We must seek trustless systems, so far as that is consistent with protection of private and public interests. However, where vulnerability remains, where that's useful, and where we rely on trust for the system to work, the question must be, is the vulnerability one that is useful to the trustor, to the individual we're asking to place trust in the system? Where trust is socially useful, we have to ensure that vulnerability isn't being taken advantage of, and we have to be able to demonstrate the value of that vulnerability to the data subject. That's the responsibility that each of the parties involved share. And that's the responsibility that has to be taken seriously if we can enable sharing with the private sector under conditions that will protect and promote public confidence in the confidentiality of a health service. Okay. Thanks for your time today. I look forward to the discussion.
All right, thank you for really, really interesting material. I'm really looking forward to the discussion that is I will be facilitating first. So yes, I would like to remind everybody in the audience that you can ask questions or make comments in the Q&A tool, which is in Zoom. You can also feel welcome to pop up your hand and virtually stand up in the meeting and ask your question, and we can promote you up into the panel room. For now, I'm going to now invite each of our discussants to make their commentaries, and then I will, of course, hand the floor back over to Mark, who's with us live now, and who can respond, and then we will address the questions from the audience. So first, I will start with my colleague, Dr. Sumytra Menon. She is co-director for Centres, which is the Clinical Ethics Network and Research Ethics Support Initiative here at the Centre for Biomedical Ethics. She's also a lawyer by training, and her research interests are in healthcare decision-making and law on mental capacity. Thanks, Sumi. Take it away.
Thank you, Tamara, for that kind introduction. It's my great pleasure to be here today, and thank you, Mark, for that excellent presentation, which has given us a lot to think about when we're considering how we might share with the private sector. Your talk actually made me recall a series of articles that I read about something that had happened recently in the UK, coming on upon after that sort of Care.data debacle that happened a few years ago. And in May, there was a scheme announced by the NHS. It was in the media portrayed as a data grab, where the data that GPs have collected from their patients would be shared with private companies for the purposes of research and planning. And it turned out that patients had only 6 weeks to opt out if they wanted to. And it sounded as though there had been very little, if any, consultation with patients or even other healthcare professionals. So there was a huge uproar about this. And the date to opt out was then moved back to the end of August. And so when I was listening to your presentation, I sort of quickly followed up on that. And now they've completely put it on ice because there have been so many complaints about the scheme and the lack of consultation. And I think one of the main reasons why so many people were concerned about the scheme was that even though the claim was made that some personal identifiers would be removed, it wasn't clear what was going to be removed. And some privacy commentators thought that actually what was being anonymized or de-identified could be reversed. So there wasn't enough information for everyone concerned, and great suspicion about who this data was going to be shared with. So I think, those sorts of incidents really make members of the public and other people, professionals generally, even to some extent, lose confidence with these sorts of arrangements, which potentially could benefit everyone, but they do have to be done in a way that fosters trust, that engages with the relevant stakeholders and allows enough time for people to air their concerns, refine proposals before moving forward. So yes, thank you very much. And I look forward to hearing everybody else's comments and questions.
Thanks, Sumi. Yes, the importance of transparency around these arrangements. Okay, so now I'm going to invite Dr. Carl Firth. He is the CEO of ASLAN Pharmaceuticals, which is a Singapore-based but a NASDAQ-listed biopharmaceutical company that is developing innovative treatments for patients. He's also independent director of Accelerate, which is the commercial arm of Singapore's A*STAR, which is the major funding agency for scientific research in Singapore. He also came down and talked to our the members of our citizens jury last year when we ran asking this very question about what sort of circumstances would it be acceptable to share data that's been gathered in a precision medicine program with the private sector, including pharmaceutical companies like the one he heads up. So I'll hand it over to you, Carl.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Tamara. I do believe I'm the sole representative of the healthcare industry here, and as a result feel somewhat like the bad guy here, but of course very happy to have the opportunity to represent our industry. As you can probably hear from my voice, I am a Brit, and as a result, perhaps more paranoid than most about what happens to my data. So I have worked in the industry for most of my career. The last 10 years, as Tamara mentioned, been building a company here in Singapore called ASLAN Pharmaceuticals. We don't sell drugs, but we are in the process of hopefully developing new treatments, particularly for inflammatory diseases like atopic dermatitis. There are 5 points that I really would like to make in response to some of the excellent points made by Mark, Sumytra, and indeed some of the panelists yesterday. The first is that our industry is already today the most highly regulated industry on the planet, and regulation will be needed to govern how data is used and processed. As an industry, we work with regulatory bodies, we work with ethics boards, patients, advocacy groups, clinicians and government to ensure that what we do is ethical, legal, and in keeping with all our stakeholder expectations. And there should be no different when it comes to how we as an industry work with healthcare data, and we expect that, and I think that is certainly the desirable outcome for all. The second point is that for decades, we as an industry have been involved in collecting and utilizing large amounts of data from patients. Now, we do this in the context of clinical trials. When healthy volunteers or patients join a clinical study, they must agree to the collection and use of their data. And in many cases, that includes genomic information, medical history, and other healthcare data that could be collected, in some cases over a long period of time. Now, rarely do individuals refuse participation in a clinical trial due to the way their data is collected and used. Now, what we are talking about today does go beyond simply a clinical study, as we're talking about possibly using data for a broad range of purposes. But the point is, many of the issues around consent, security, anonymization, and regulating those processing the data are not new to the industry. The third point I'd like to make is that at one level, we may say we don't trust companies and we do trust government. However, what we do suggests we trust companies much more than we trust government and perhaps the public sector. So to give you a few examples of this, I think in Singapore, many people will know that there was a rollout of a very important strategy to try and cope with the outbreak of COVID, the launch of the Trace-Together app. And when that was launched in Singapore, a large number of people expressed concern with how data was being collected and used. The government struggled to encourage sufficient people to download the app. And it was only when it became a necessary part of life to get into restaurants, offices, malls, did the government hit its targets. Now, where was the trust with something as basic as Trace-Together, which stores a minimal amount of data on your own phone? In contrast, we routinely allow companies like Apple, Google, Facebook to collect huge amounts of data, not only on our health, but we allow them to track our location, to access our messages, to see into our innermost thoughts, right down to our religious beliefs and the type of person we'd like to date. Indeed, in many geographies, it's the larger companies such as Facebook or Google that has to defend against unwanted government intrusion into our lives. Governments make thousands of requests to these companies to access our personal information, and these companies have to stand in our defense and do their best to deny those requests. My fourth point is that healthcare companies have perhaps done a better job protecting our data than other companies in the public sector. So to my knowledge, there have not been any major incidents where a pharma or a biotech company has had healthcare data stolen. In contrast, we hear about another hotel chain, airline, or supermarket that has had its customer databases compromised or hacked on a regular basis. In Singapore, the two largest breaches in healthcare have been government. The first was a massive breach in the Sing Health database to expose 1.5 million patient records, and the breach and open publication of the MOH database storing personal data on Singapore's HIV positive population. My fifth and final point is that healthcare companies operate in a world where they expect to compensate individuals or institutions for data that could lead to a new drug or a new medical device. If a company acquires a new technology from NUS or another government institution, they need to pay for that. Accessing healthcare data should be no different. Companies do not expect to use this data purely for their own gain, but to enter into partnership to see how they can generate meaningful medical insight from data, turn it into something that can benefit patients, and share the value with those who have contributed. Now, at the end of the day, our industry has done a pretty lousy job at communicating what we have done and the successes that sharing data with industry has brought about. And so there is a problem of perception. And as an industry, we need to spend more time talking about the benefits that this type of data sharing can bring. And just to throw out a few examples, we wouldn't have targeted therapies today to treat cancer. And these are treatments that have transformed the way that we treat cancer today. We wouldn't have been able to prove that the MMR vaccine is not linked to autism. And we wouldn't know the key risk factors that cause mortality with COVID, which has allowed us to prioritize vaccinations for the most needy. So appreciate to be able to contribute some of those comments and look forward to the discussion later on.
Thanks a lot, Carl. Very much appreciate your commentary, and I look forward to picking up on some of the points that you've made later in this discussion. Before we get to that point, I'll now like to invite Dr. Chris Degeling, who is a senior fellow in the School of Health and Society at the University of Wollongong. He conducts value-based social science research to explore health policy problems and inform policy processes. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Tamara, and thanks everybody for coming today. First,
I'd like to acknowledge that I'm talking to you today from Wadi Wadi country of the Darwal peoples in southern New South Wales. I also live in a country where the major problems with data breaches have been government sourced. We have government structures and government bureaucracies here which seem to be particularly used to having inept ways of managing large data stores and even publishing things and challenging people to unravel them, which they can usually do, and then quickly withdrawing them, as it happened not so long ago with an encryption thing that they were quite proud of and then turned out not to be so useful. I think probably in terms of responding to Mark's excellent talk and all the points that he has made, which are sound and obviously guiding in how we should approach this issue, is to reflect upon some of the work that we have done deliberatively engaging with members of the public in Australia around data management. And in particular, most of the work I've done is around the management and use of personalized data in terms of infectious disease risk or infectious disease state. So around pathogenomics, and then also sort of the epidemiological questions on that. This data can obviously be used to further research in all sorts of different ways. And in the engagements we had, much of the frameworks which have been proposed in terms of establishing trustworthiness played out in the discussions and deliberations that took place in those groups. We haven't really had engagement. I did some work around COVID Safe App, also to just touch on what Carl has spoken about in terms of the usage of new technologies and trust in that. And in both these circumstances, there was a lack of trust in government to manage data, and this is probably to do with the Australian experience of having these massive data breaches. But there was also a really clear way in which they wanted those who are charged with governing data and ensuring data systems are just and fair, take this idea of role and responsibility very seriously. And don't just use it as a weasel word, but actually unpack all the dimensions of responsibility and respond to them appropriately. So if you think about responsibility, it's kind of this nebulous concept which hangs around a couple of ideas, whether that's sort of causation, the role that you might have, your capacity to act in a role, the outcome of what you're meant to be achieving, the virtue of what you're doing, whether it's moral or immoral, and then the liability for what actually happens if you are irresponsible and something goes wrong. When we use this idea of responsibility and being responsible for the role that you have in governance and establishing trustworthy systems and making them transparent and making them accountable, that accountability dimension is quite important to how people feel about trust. So if you establish a system that doesn't have capacity to have oversight, if you don't fund it properly, if you don't establish an independence from the organization which it's meant to be overseeing, then you're going to have issues with trustworthiness. If you don't have a clear pathway of causality in terms of understanding how things roll out and how mistakes are made, then you don't have this idea of trustworthiness. If the roles aren't clear, if the regulator is not separated in a way which makes their role very distinct and empowers them to act in ways which means that they can punish those who behave irresponsibly or betray that trust, then there are going to be problems with trustworthiness. So what I do, I guess, is trying to extend Mark's discussion a little bit into the nitty-gritty of what this actually means and the granular way in which publics think about and rationalize these issues. Publics really want public goods. They understand their uses and they understand the benefits that they get from them. What they don't want is for that to be for profit, has been identified, but they're willing to accept that profit as long as those roles and responsibilities in general are clear and transparent and are actionable and well managed in the discussions and the processes that we've run around these issues. And at that point, I'll stop.
All right, thank you very much, Chris. And finally, I'll ask Professor E Shyong Tai, who is a co-investigator on the one of the grants that has been funding this research that we've been doing in Singapore. He's also he's a professor at the National University of Singapore's Saw Swee Hock School of Public Health. He's also a senior consultant at the National University Hospital. Thanks, E Shyong.
Thanks very much, Tamara. And look, I'll point out that I'm a professor of medicine and not ethics or bioethics. But we have sort of struggled with some of these issues, and I thought maybe I sort of mentioned three things. Mark, your comment about trust is sort of really interesting. And as I listened to sort of Carl and Chris talk about sort of data breaches, one of the things that struck me, and I think, Tamara, this came out of our own sort of studies too, is that the public are reasonably tolerant of data breaches. In fact, they kind of feel that it's inevitable. And so somehow the occurrence of these data breaches doesn't seem to impact on trust. And as I listened to the conversation that was going on beforehand, it occurred to me that sometimes the trust in an organization, so the WHO that you pointed out, Mark, actually comes from things that have nothing to do with the management of the data or the data at hand. It actually comes, so I think as an example, one of the things that we found during the sort of COVID-19 sort of issue, and you know, despite the problem that we had with Trace Together, COVID-19 has increased trust in the Singapore government and across completely unrelated areas. And I find that an interesting concept to think a little bit about. The second, Chris, you sort of mentioned that the public are interested in public goods and services, and I think that's really interesting. And Carl, you know, your point's well taken that somebody has to pay for it. One of the things that has come up in the conversation, though, is really to sort of begin to ask the question: when public data is used to generate new products and services, how can we increase the likelihood that those members of the public will have access to those public products and services? And I think that's been a real struggle for us, because by and large, when we start to have these conversations, that's a red flag for most pharmaceutical companies, and we just don't know how to have those conversations. And then finally, Mark, one of the things that I personally struggle with is really this question of public engagement. And the question I suppose I had was, how do we know when we've done enough? Is it enough that, you know, if you get away with it and you haven't gotten into trouble, is that a signal that that what you're doing is right? Or is there a better way to sort of think about that?
Okay, I'll take that as that you're going to wind up there. All right, so I don't envy you, Mark, that you've got a lot to quite a rich discourse to respond to there. So, but I'll let you have a go of it.
Thanks, Tamara. I won't try and address it all. I hope we'll pick up quite a lot of this in the discussion between ourselves. But just starting with Sumytra's, your points in relation to what's been described as that data grab in the UK. I think one of the things that demonstrated was the importance of opt-out, the importance of people feeling that they are able to meaningfully express a preference and be able to, even if they're not given a choice to opt in, be able to decide that the value proposition that has been articulated just is not worth it for them. Because I think often these things have fallen over when people have not been persuaded that the value proposition for them is worth it when it comes to their data being used. So we have to get so much better at both enabling people to express preferences, both preferences for data not to be used, but also preferences for data to be used. And that's also really important and is often overlooked. I was involved in the OECD recommendation for health data governance, and I was really pleased that within that, we acknowledged the importance of allowing people to express a preference for data to be used as well as for it not to be. So it seems that most of the concern sits when people can't opt out and they don't see there to be a fair return, or at least fair return is not perceived. And Carl, I think this picks up on your point that sometimes even if there is a perception of fair return on part of the companies or whatever involved, that's not necessarily articulated in a way that people accept and agree with. And a lot of the companies which we're talking about aren't actually pharma companies in the work that I've been involved in. The biggest concern in relation to pharma companies and their use, because they do have a good track record, as you say, with regard to use of data. The biggest concerns in relation to the pharma companies are in relation to disproportionate profits. So it's not that people don't like what they're doing with the data, they just wonder whether they might be making a little bit more money than they need to, and whether they might not be sharing as much of the benefit back with others as they could be. But it's not the purposes for which pharma companies are using data that tend to trouble people. It's the purposes that other companies might use data for in both authorized or unauthorized ways. And this relates to one of the other concerns with big companies and big data companies in particular. There's an increasing perception that maybe they're beyond the law because they're just so big, they're so wealthy, their pockets are so deep that even if they get fined for misbehaving, they just write that off as the cost of doing business. So I don't think it's certainly not pharma that I was particularly seeking to have a go at, not really having a go at anyone. I'm just pointing out the levels of concern that exist when you talk to people about sharing data that's been principally gathered within a public context and was been given for the purposes of enabling care to be delivered, then being used for commercial purposes, where study after study has shown that there is concern. And that is in part, I think, due to the context collapse that Welcome described, which is different to when an organization gets data from a consumer. They sign up to their Apple or their Google and they sign away their rights to all these uses, where that's done in a different context with a different mindset. And I'd actually argue that's not particularly signaling trust anyway. It's just signaling people don't really feel that they've got much choice if they want to use the services. So I agree that we do need to much better articulate the benefits, and I agree that much has to be done to articulate the responsibility for both doing that and for what happens if things go wrong. I'll just finish, I think, and we'll finish this and open up the more general discussion by saying that often, in my experience, this is not about people coming together and trying to do the wrong thing. This is about people coming together and trying to do the right thing, often with the very best of intentions. But sometimes having the very best of intentions can blind you, or you just don't tend to consider what a bad actor might do or what a consumer might fear you could do. And so sometimes just taking the moment to consider what, if you were so minded, what you could do with this data that people would not be comfortable with, and being able to demonstrate that the controls are in place to prevent that. That was also, to go back to where I started with the comments in relation to the NHS and the use of NHS data. Some of the concerns there were that initially the ministers couldn't answer the questions when they were asked, could this be sold to an insurance company? And could it be used for solely commercial purposes? And it could have been. There was no intent for it to be at the time, at least I don't believe there to be, talking to the individuals involved, but it could have been. There was nothing that prevented that. And so they couldn't provide the reassurances when the journalists doorstopped them. And so they changed the law. So now it can't be used for solely commercial purposes. But it became a much more painful and protracted experience for all concerned than it would have been if they hadn't only thought about the good that could be done with the data, but they'd also thought about the bad and the harm that could have been done with it, and taken proactive steps to demonstrate that that wasn't going to be possible and who would actually have responsibility if things went wrong.